On the next Humankind,
I can certainly understand that if you had a father or a son or a lover or a brother in the war, you wanted to believe that he was fighting in a righteous war, that he was fighting valiantly, that his death, if it came, was not anonymous, that it held significance.
Images of military valor as well as anti-war sentiment in American literature. I'm David Freudberg. Join us for Humankind. Humankind is produced in association with WGBH Boston and supported by the Humankind Program Fund.
I can certainly understand that if you had a father or a son or a lover or a brother in the war, you wanted to believe that he was fighting in a righteous war, that he was fighting valiantly, that his death, if it came, was not anonymous, that it held significance. You didn't want to think of him hunched in a trench. You didn't want to think of him shot by artillery launched from far away. You didn't want to think about him suffering on a battlefield. You didn't want to think about his blackened and bloated corpse lying unburied on a battlefield. That wasn't the image that would be uplifting. It wouldn't bolster morale.
How American literature shapes our views of warfare, including the anti-war writing of Mark Twain. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. As a nation founded in Revolutionary War, the United States has frequently been ensnared in military conflict. War occupies not only our history books and our national calendar, but also American popular culture, from songs, movies, and museums to our literary tradition.
Almost all of our prominent writers have written about war. Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, Nathaniel Hawthorne. But even after those writers of the late 19th century, people like William Faulkner wrote about war. His first novel is a work named Soldier's Pay, which is about World War I. Hemingway, of course, wrote about war. So many of our most famous authors, and they wrote about it in any number of genres: poetry, fiction, nonfiction, essays. Once you move beyond writers, obviously sermons, letters, diaries.
Cynthia Wachtell is Research Associate Professor of American Studies at Yeshiva University in New York City. She has explored how American authors record and present their impressions of military conflict.
Even since historic times, there's been two ways of looking at war. The very romantic view of war as heroic, as gallant, as valiant, and an anti-war way of looking at war. And you can see that in things like Lysistrata and the Trojan Woman, going back to classical literature. But you can also see it reflected in Civil War literature. It wasn't acceptable during the Civil War to be questioning the morality of war. It wasn't acceptable to be showing certain aspects of war. For example, war deaths in popular literature of the Civil War were highly sanitized. Men maybe took a bullet to the breast and they died painless deaths, and they were buried immediately and their friends mourned over them, and it was all very tidy. You didn't, for example, see in Civil War literature in instances in which men took a bullet to the head or had agonizing deaths, or were left anonymously on the battlefield. So there's this range of ways in which war is conveyed, and this is true through to the present, but certainly true at the time of the Civil War. And if we delve, though, we can see that writers were questioning the morality of war, if only in their private letters, in their diaries, in less popularly published works, that there was this range of interpretations of war from the earliest days of the Civil War, and it's continued through to the present.
One of America's most lyrical observers of war was the 19th century poet and essayist Walt Whitman. A pioneer of free verse, Whitman's most famous work, entitled Leaves of Grass, was first published 6 years before hostilities commenced in the Civil War. His perceptions of war would evolve, especially during the long, agonizing months when Whitman volunteered as a nurse tending to injured soldiers. His complex views are discussed in Cynthia Wachtell's book, War No More, The Anti-War Impulse in American Literature.
So Whitman started out the war in New York City, and he was in his early 40s, and he didn't enlist. However, he did write a number of poems helping with enlistments, encouraging people to enlist, sort of upbeat battle recruiting poems, and his brother went off to fight in the war among the very, very earliest volunteers.
Squads gather everywhere by common consent and arm. The new recruits, even boys, the old men show them how to wear their accoutrements. They buckle the straps carefully. Outdoors arming, indoors arming, the flash of the musket barrels. War, be it weeks, months, or years, an armed race is advancing to welcome it.
And when the Battle of Fredericksburg arrived in December of 1862, Whitman found out from his newspaper that his brother had been injured in that battle. But the newspaper didn't give an indication of how severely his brother had been injured, and there's no way to know other than to rush to Fredericksburg as his family's emissary and try to find his brother and see if his brother was still alive. So Whitman did that, and he found his brother quite well. He had a gash to the cheek, but was recovering and was going to be fine. But Whitman was really horrified by what he saw when he arrived in Fredericksburg. One of the first sights he saw was a heap of amputated limbs outside improvised field hospital. And he saw the bodies of men blackened and bloated who'd been killed in the battle, and these bodies at the time that he was visiting were left unburied. So he sort of had a moral revulsion from war. He had supported the Union cause, and he continued to support the Union cause, but we see in his private writings him dealing with his conflict of convictions. How do you condone war when it's inherently immoral? And in his diary, dating from this period when he visited Fredericksburg, he confides to his diary his doubts about war and confides to his diary certain images of war which would never appear in his published poetry. For example, he wrote in his diary, "Oh, the hideous damned hell of war. Were the preachers preaching of hell? Oh, there is no hell more damned than this hell of war."
What do you think that Walt Whitman meant when he wrote at one point that real war will never get in the books?
So I think he was really conflicted. Walt Whitman wanted to believe in America. He's the great, democratic voice of America, and not democratic as in Democrats versus Republicans, but as in celebrating America, celebrating all Americans, celebrating the potential of America. So he wanted to believe that the Civil War demonstrated the best of America, that people had put aside their self-interest to fight for this common good, that the crass materialism, the individualism that was sort of selfish before the war was being replaced by this honorable venture of war. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. If you are being told poem after poem, newspaper after newspaper, year after year, that the war that you're fighting in is righteous, that God is on our side. So we have the Northerners believing that, and there are poems on the South which are telling them the same thing. Our cause is unequivocally right. We are fighting the righteous war. So I think it allows people to feel good about the war they're fighting, to accept the loss, to accept the pain, to make self-sacrifice, to keep up, good spirits, or the nearest thing to good spirits. And again, it was a 4-year-long war, a phenomenally long war.
And an unbelievably brutal butchery of a war.
And one fought on our own soil, which, the last one fought on our own soil.
But in an edition of Leaves of Grass published at the end of the Civil War, Walt Whitman was moved to depict a despondent scene of war.
We come to an open space in the woods and halt by the dim-lighted building. 'Tis a large old church at the crossing roads. 'Tis now an impromptu hospital. Entering but for a minute, I see a sight beyond all the pictures and poems ever made. Shadows of deepest, deepest black, just lit by moving candles and lamps. And by one great pitchy torch, stationary, with wild red flame and clouds of smoke. By these, crowds, groups of forms, vaguely I see, on the floor, some in the pews laid down. At my feet, more distinctly, a soldier, a mere lad, in danger of bleeding to death. He is shot in the abdomen. I staunch the blood temporarily. The youngster's face is white as a lily. Then, before I depart, I sweep my eyes o'er the scene, fain to absorb it all. Faces, varieties, postures beyond description, most in obscurity, some of them dead. Surgeons operating, attendants holding lights, the smell of ether, the odor of blood, the crowd, the crowd of the bloody forms of soldiers, the yard outside also filled. Some on the bare ground, some on planks or stretchers, some in the death spasms sweating. An occasional scream or cry, the doctor's shouted orders or calls, the glisten of the little steel instruments catching the glint of the torches. I bend to the dying lad, his eyes open, a half smile gives he me. Then the eyes close, calmly close, and I speed forth to the darkness, resuming, marching, ever in darkness marching on in the ranks, the unknown road still marching.
Let's talk about Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the popular Civil War anthem, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. What kind of transformation did she experience?
So she is a really interesting writer. So she wrote this phenomenal poem, and it went on to become the hymn of the Union. It was phenomenally popular. But Julia Ward Howe, soon after the end of the Civil War, had a change of heart. And scholars have theorized whether this had to do with the death of one of her sons or her broader understanding of war. And
so she lost a son in the war?
No, I think she lost a little boy in the years after. It wasn't war-related, but that, maybe as a mother in grieving or as someone who was becoming increasingly aware of the cost of war, broadly speaking, across the world, she had a change of heart. And 8 years after she penned the Battle Hymn of the Republic, she wrote another work, which was called An Appeal to Womanhood Throughout the World. So by this point, she had renounced war, had renounced it as a means to an end, had come to see it as violent. And what she did was she called upon women the world over to join together in an effort to speak out against war.
Arise then, women of this day, say firmly, our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have taught them of charity, mercy, and patience. We, women of one country, will be too tender of those of another to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council. Let them meet first, as women, to bewail and commemorate the dead. Let them solemnly take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace, each bearing after his own time the sacred impress not of Caesar's, but of God.
What is really interesting is that no one followed her. She couldn't gain followers at that point in time. Women weren't interested in joining her in speaking out against war.
Even someone as famous as the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Yes, and years later, in her autobiography, which was published in 1899, she wrote, "The ladies who spoke out in public in those days mostly confined their labors to the advocacy of women's suffrage, and were not much interested in my scheme of a worldwide protest of women against the cruelties of war." And what's really interesting and a little bit unexpected for me was I found that in the entire period that I study, from the start of the Civil War to the eve of World War I, there were virtually no women writing against war, that the writers who I did identify were almost uniformly male. It changes with the advent of World War I. During World War I and afterwards, we find many instances of women anti-war writers, but during this roughly 50-year period, virtually none.
Why?
I don't know. I don't know whether it was a social convention that women didn't think that they could speak out against war, or they were more inclined to be romantic. Certainly they had less access to the battlefront, so maybe they really did not understand how violent the war was. I've pondered that, and I don't have an easy answer to it other than to note that it's a really interesting sort of gender gap.
We're talking with Cynthia Wachtell, author of War No More. She has studied how war is depicted in American literature, including a thread of anti-war writing from some of our most famous authors. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. For more information on this segment, Words of War and Peace, please visit our website, humanmedia.org. Let's talk about maybe America's most famous writer, Mark Twain. What do we know about his views on war?
So Mark Twain fascinates me in so many ways. And again, it fascinates me that we're not better acquainted with his views on war. And what may come as a surprise to many is the fact that Mark Twain actually fought in the Civil War. And I know I should...
On the side of the Confederacy.
On the side of the Confederacy. He fought in an unofficial group of soldiers at the very start of the war in his home state of Missouri. And these soldiers were not, again, officially part of the Confederacy, which is why Mark Twain was able to walk away after a number of weeks and head out west to join his brother. But nonetheless, Mark Twain did fight. And years later, he would actually write about his experience fighting for the Confederacy in a famous series published by Century Magazine, which was called Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. So in 1885, Mark Twain wrote a piece which was self-mocking about his experiences in the Civil War as part of the self-designated group of ragtag soldiers who were called the Marion Rangers. And he makes light of the experience. He says that they roamed the countryside, and at the least sign of danger, they fled in the other direction. But he also offers a profound moral lesson sort of hidden in this would-be humorous account of his experiences in the Civil War. And what happens is that on a dark night, and this is really the culmination of what happens in this narrative, on a dark night, the Marion Rangers mistake a man on horseback for a Union soldier, and they shoot him out of his saddle. And Twain recalls that at the time he initially felt a surge of exhilaration, and then immediately he was struck with a sense of remorse. And he writes about his realization that he had killed the man, a man who had never done him any harm, that it was, quote, the coldest sensation that ever went through his marrow. So we hear Twain there thinking about the implications of killing this man, and he elaborates and says, the man was not in uniform and was not armed. He was a stranger in the country. That was all we ever found out about him. The thought of him got to preying upon me every night. I could not get rid of it. I could not drive it away. The taking of that unoffending life seemed such a wanton thing, and it seemed an epitome of war. That all war must be just that, the killing of strangers against whom you feel no personal animosity, strangers whom, in other circumstances, you would help if you found them in trouble, and who would help you if you needed it. So we hear Mark Twain there, in his reflections upon the Civil War, offering a profound moral lesson, saying war is murder. All war can be boiled down to the murder of this unoffending man, that is the epitome of war. And Mark Twain reacted with horror. He left the Marion Rangers. He, again, is self-mocking in the account. He says, I wasn't man enough to fight in the war. But if you listen carefully to what he says, he also says that he had to flee while he could preserve some remnant of his self-respect. In other words, a self-respecting man will not engage in war. He will not engage in murder. And we hear him decades later, after the Spanish-American War, the war in Cuba, and America's incursion in the Philippines, again returning to the theme of war and again condemning war. He revisits it in a very famous piece called The War Prayer, but that's a piece that wasn't published in his own day, that magazines refused to publish in his own day and was only published posthumously. And
imagine magazines refusing to publish something by Mark Twain in his own day. It's almost unthinkable now.
Right. So, again, that's an indices that this was still sort of a hot subject, something you wouldn't really, if you were a magazine, want to necessarily get too near.
So can you tell us about the war prayer?
It's a brief piece and
very biting.
Yeah, very biting. So what he essentially does is he envisions this sort of wholesome scene of a community coming together in their church on a Sunday morning, but it's during a time of war, and he imagines that the sermon is about flashing sabers and bronzed heroes and golden seas of glory, and how God's going to help the soldiers and grant them and their flag and their country imperishable honor and glory. So this sort of rhetoric of war, the righteous war rhetoric. And what Twain does is insert into this scene an outsider. He writes that a man with billowing white hair arrives in the church and sort of commands everyone's attention. And what he does is he sort of paraphrases the rhetoric which has been spoken before he arrives, but puts it in much more blunt terms.
O Lord, our God, help us tear their soldiers to bloody shreds with our shells. Help us to cover their smiling fields with the pale forms of their patriot dead. Help us to drown the thunder of the guns with the shrieks of their wounded, writhing in pain. Help us to waste their humble homes with a hurricane of fire. Help us to wring the hearts of their unoffending widows with unavailing grief. Help us to turn them out roofless with their children to wander unfriended in the wastes of their desolated land, in rags and hunger and thirst, sports of the sun flames in summer and the icy winds of winter, broken in spirit, worn with travail, imploring thee for the refuge of the grave and denied it. For our sakes who adore thee, Lord, blast their hopes, blight their lives, protract their bitter pilgrimage, make heavy their steps, water their way with their tears, stain the white snow with the blood of their wounded feet. We ask it in the spirit of love of him who is the source of love, and who is the ever-faithful refuge and friend of all that are sore beset and seek his aid with humble and contrite hearts. Amen.
War is often justified in a number of ways, but one of the most common ways is that of righteous war, of crusade, of jihad.
In explicitly religious terms.
Certainly. I mean, if you look at World War I, even if the initial purpose of the war is not as a crusade, during World War I, the churches across America came out in support of the war. And those religious leaders who tried to speak against the war lost their congregations, lost their churches, lost their pulpits. So this is a pretty uniform pattern that in times of war it's expected that the clergy and other religious leaders will be in support of war, that they will be helping to boost patriotism, that they won't be questioning war, they won't be questioning killing in war.
How does this history of anti-war sentiment and anti-war writing speak to our understanding today of warfare?
I think about this a lot. I see a lot of parallels. And I think it's important that we have this knowledge that American anti-war literature is not something new. I think it's really important that we understand that among our great American writers are some great anti-war writers. I think the risk is that anti-war writers are sometimes labeled as being un-American, unpatriotic. So I think it's really important that we understand Mark Twain was an anti-war writer. Yet we can't really think of a more patriotic writer than Mark Twain. He gave us Huck Finn. He gave us Tom Sawyer. He's the most classic American writer that we have. So I think it reframes our understanding of anti-war writing, of American writing, and of the current wars to understand that this is a really deep-rooted tradition in America, in American literature, to question the morality of war, to question the meaning of war, to question modern warfare, to question the means of modern warfare, and that so many of the issues which are being raised today are ones which were addressed by people who we revere in the decades past, in centuries past. And I think it's really important that we read the writers who are writing about our current wars and that we know that many great works remain to be written about our current wars. There's usually a delay. So probably in 10 or 15 years, we'll see what will come to hail as the great works about Iraq and Afghanistan being published.
Otherwise, just a little too sensitive of a territory to write the greatest works so close to the actual events.
I mean, it's happened in the past, and certainly with the Civil War, we see the poetry. Longer works tend to take more time, and what we saw certainly with the instance of Vietnam was that soldiers needed and officers and journalists needed the distance of time, both physical, and sort of emotional and spatial, to come to terms with their experiences. So Tim O'Brien and Philip Caputo and Michael Hare all took about a decade before they really started writing about the Vietnam War.
And I remember the TV series MASH,
right,
which was set not in Vietnam, although it was being broadcast during the Vietnam War and clearly was a commentary on the Vietnam War. It was set in Korea.
Exactly.
It was like it was just a little too close for comfort.
Exactly. And also if you look at two other works which were published in the 1960s, Catch-22 came out in the early 1960s, obviously about World War II. So, again, a lag in the time of the war to the time of publication. And Slaughterhouse-5, which comes out at the end of the 1960s, which is also about World War II, about the firebombing of Dresden, but also was interpreted as a commentary on Vietnam. That war is bad, and hence the war that we're in is likewise bad. But we see writers needing this time to develop their thoughts.
It may be that the trauma of war lodges so deep in the human psyche that only at some distance can its full dimension, its full horror be grasped. And that raises the question of whether some literary and journalistic accounts of war reflect a degree of self-censorship.
For example, with our current wars, even a couple of years ago, the New York Times ran a piece saying, well, there have been, I think, something like, 40 photographers taking pictures of our current wars and thousands of images, but only a very small number of dead American soldiers. So what's the effect of misrepresenting, a war? If we've had upwards of 4,000 soldiers killed in Iraq and mounting soldiers killed in Afghanistan, what does it mean if you serve to put forth certain sorts of images and not other sorts of images? What is the cost of omission? And I think that that's what we're seeing both now and with the Civil War is a sort of omission. We're omitting images which won't sit right with the public, whether those images are in poetry or whether they're in photography. It's a way of shaping the representation of war to match the nation's perceived needs.
Cynthia Wachtell is Research Associate Professor of American Studies at Yeshiva University in New York City and author of War No More, the Anti-War Impulse in American Literature. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. Studio recording by Antonio Oliart. Editorial assistance from Thomas Royal and Kathy Graham. Webmaster Brian K. Johnson. Special thanks to Don Goonan, Laura Carlo, Mike Wilkins, and Tony Buck. Our program is produced by Human Media in association with WGBH Boston. Program development provided by Shart Media.
To purchase a CD copy of this program, please call 1-800-5LISTEN. That's 1-800-5LISTEN. Or visit our website, where you can also obtain an audio download of this and our other programs and can hear selected episodes free. You can access free written materials related to this program as well. Our web address is humanmedia.org. Again, if you'd like to purchase a CD copy of Humankind by phone, please call 1-800-5LISTEN, and our web address is humanmedia.org.
This segment, Words of War and Peace, is Humankind Program number 159.
The executive producer is David Freudberg. This is Humankind.